myself. As Mike mentioned, I get the pleasure of introducing our first two speakers. First, we have Kathryn Tate. Kathryn is the president and CEO of the Legacy Center for Community Success. Kathryn believes that education is the key to improving lives, which will in turn strengthen our entire community. It is through this lens that Kathryn leads the Legacy Center. Prior to this role, Kathryn served as a certified prevention specialist at the Legacy Center. Under a close partnership with the 1016 Recovery Network, Kathryn coordinated the community's response to substance use disorder and youth substance use prevention. Prior to her coming to the Legacy Center, Kathryn served as a social insurance specialist at the Social Security Administration as an extension educator with Purdue University Extension. Kathryn has a bachelor's and master's from Purdue University and lives in Midland with her husband and two sons. Adam, our second presenter, has been creating video and other digital media content for over 15 years, and much of that work has been for a nonprofit. Thank you, Adam, for doing that. Push Production, his own business name, symbolizes a personal philosophy he has been developing since his early 20s. Coming to terms with the diagnosis of a genetic degenerative muscle disease, he started wiping the word push into the foggy bathroom mirror as a reminder to never give up, to always push forward. He is a blessed husband and father of 3 girls. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kathryn Tate and Adam and turn it over to them.
Thank you, Barry. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. Today, we're going to talk about podcasting for prevention. And this came about actually because we began a podcast about a year ago, and we'll get into that story in a few minutes. But Mike Tobias was one of our guests on our podcast earlier this year. And he thought this was a pretty cool idea. So he asked if we would consider doing a presentation for the show Audition, and we were happy to do so. Adam and I worked together, and Adam has worked closely with Angela Johnson, who was one of our prevention specialists until very recently. And she's the one that really got this off the ground for us and working closely with Adam. So we're really grateful that Adam has joined us today. All right. There we go. Here we are. As if you couldn't see us already, right? Okay, so today's objectives. Our goal is for you to understand the nuts and bolts of podcasting, how that all works, how we pull all the pieces together to put together a professional and just really interesting and engaging podcast. We also expect that you'll be able to use this podcasting as a tool to enhance your prevention initiatives, especially during this interesting time of COVID-19. And then we'll give you some tips on how you can get started with your own podcast in your own community. So, Adam, let's get started.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for giving us the space and time here to talk to you about podcasting. Normally, if I do this kind of presentation in person, I do a show of hands who listens to podcasts, but we're not going to worry too much about that here today. We're going to assume that, there's a pretty decent number of people who do listen to podcasts here, because it's becoming a even more popular medium than it was even 3 years ago. It's still growing. I do see some hands coming up, so that's kind of cool. Nice little piece here for Zoom. You want to hit the next slide?
Yes, sir.
Please. So, a podcast in its basic form, is just a recording of an audio discussion of specific topic like business, travel, sports, entertainment, and it can be listened to at the convenience of the listener through multiple different electronic devices. So you can listen to it via your laptop, but I would say the most common way people listen to podcasts is on their cell phone. And they're doing that through Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and then multiple third-party apps also that allow you to access all different kinds of podcasts. So we can talk, I'll get into a little bit of how you get your podcast and all that area, or get your podcast on all of those platforms as we move forward. So let's hit the next one.
Okay, so our podcast was kind of a journey, as going back actually years ago. We noticed over years we were holding town hall meetings. We were hoping that parents would attend, community members, so that we could educate them about substance prevention, so that we could talk about protective factors, which in our community we embrace the developmental asset framework, which is just a framework of protective factors. So we had low attendance for years. Boy, if we had 20 people show up to a town hall meeting, it was amazing most of the time. More often than not, it was 5 or maybe 10 if we were lucky. So after years of being frustrated from low attendance at town hall meetings, in 2019, we started talking about doing a podcast or a studio show. So we had a conversation with our local library. We have a Midland County TV station, and they talked to us about the option to do both a studio show and then also rip the audio and create a podcast from that. Seemed like a good idea. It seemed like a pretty massive undertaking, a little bit overwhelming. And so we never got it off the ground initially. But then came COVID-19. And we couldn't do town hall meetings, and we couldn't have in-person meetings. And what are we going to do? How are we going to reach parents, especially now, because kids are stressed and they're not at school, and everybody needs something. And somewhere in that, Angela learned about Adam and Adam's experience with podcasting. And so we began to get serious about a podcast. And the next big challenge for us was, how do we name our podcast? What do you call it that's catchy and interesting? And I will tell you that we spent way more hours than we should have on this issue. And then finally, one of my staff members suggested, directions not included. No one tells us how to raise our kids. No one, there's not a book that comes home from the hospital. That might be a really great name for us. And it just stuck. And then Michelle Beck created a really cool logo that shows, our logos pushing out in different directions, with arrows pushing out in different directions not included. So it was a really great fit. And that's how the podcast came to be. Once we had those basics figured out, we were ready to get our plan in place and start pulling in guests and begin recording.
So thanks, Kathryn. Before I step into the first bullet point there of, what is your area of expertise, I'll give you a little bit of background on my podcast history. So an organization called Our Community Listens, that's now been renamed as Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities, came to me about 4 years ago with the idea of producing content videos to help support their communications course. And they had ideas of producing these long form videos, and a great idea. But I said to them, I know where your budget's at, and I know to do that the way that you really truly want to do it, video is going to be expensive. There's just more to it if you want to produce a piece of videography. So I pitched to them, what if we start first and just see how it goes? And what if we start with a podcast? And the idea to reinforce all of the lessons and the teachings in the communications course. Well, they loved that idea. We started developing what that looked like, and creating an episode sketch outline, because they had information that they wanted to share in specific episodes. And I think I just produced the 72nd episode this past week, or last week actually. So that's how it started for them. And the idea of like a limited budget, they knew they had they wanted to get more information out there and provide more content for people who have been through their communications course. And that's where we kind of built their podcast off of. So the first question here on this slide is, what is your area of expertise? So for them, it was their communications course. They wanted to continue to get all of the principles out and give resources to people who have been through it and give them another way to refresh themselves on everything. So consider, speaking on subjects that you know very well. Obviously, they're speaking initially to a pretty limited audience, and that has changed over the years in my work with them. So I could touch on that later if anybody has questions, but we can discuss that if we need to. But that's basically what we started with for them, their expertise and their subject matter. And then we started with, what do we want the people to know? So we just created a list of objectives. And then we started thinking about, what style of podcast do you want to create? So an interview style, I don't know how many people are looking at the screen exactly, so I will go through each one listed here. But interview style, pretty basic, pretty straightforward. The idea here is you have a host, and then maybe you have someone step in as the subject matter expert, or you have someone step in with their personal experiences, and you just kind of do an interview. Conversational is a little bit of the blend of the two, where maybe the host is providing their own take on certain things, their own information. So it's a little more conversational, but multiple people on the podcast at one time. Monologue would be just, think of it just like a late night TV monologue, but without the jokes, or potentially with some jokes, but producing something all on your own, getting the information out there, and no one else really involved in a podcast. Storytelling, investigative styles, that includes anything from just sitting down and talking to somebody about their experiences to potentially creating a timeline of events, and stepping through things with the listener. Roundtable, very similar to the conversational, the idea of having multiple experts on, sitting and talking about a subject. And then repurposed content. So here's something for lots of, I would assume, those of you who are working on limited budgets, to think about is repurposed content. So if you were to do a Zoom presentation potentially for a set group, almost like we're doing today, we could take the audio from this, and maybe you would need to record a separate intro, where you kind of set up what exactly they're about to listen to, but you could repurpose, a 30-minute or 40-minute presentation and go from there. I see a question in the chat here from Barry about, can these be a mixture, or can there be a mixture of these, or is one a best style? I think it can depend on, first of all, how you answer those first two questions about what's your area of expertise and what do you want people to know. And it may also depend on what your capacity is as a business. So if you have a little more time and you don't have, you don't expect there being much trouble to schedule guests or find guests, then I would say, a conversation or an interview style is a pretty common and pretty solid way to go. It's more or less the way that we've been producing the Directions Not Included podcast. But if, let's say, you don't have as much expendable time in your day to take on those kinds of things, maybe a monologue would be something that you'd be able to produce much quicker and easier. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Kathryn. So one of the biggest questions a lot of people ask me, because I'm the technical guy and the producer, is, what kind of equipment do we need? What do you need to get started to, start a podcast? One of the first things to consider is a recording platform. And essentially that could be a lot of different things. It could be your cell phone, or, when I say recording platform, all I really mean is something to record your voice, right? So it could be your cell phone. It could be opening up a Zoom meeting where you're the, even the only attendant, and you're just using Zoom to record it. It could be actually using editing software like Adobe Audition or Odyssey. And so those come into play with the editing software. So whatever you utilize as a recording platform, just you have to learn how to get the file from it. So if you use Zoom, where is it going to be saved? If you use your cell phone, how do I get it to the computer so I can edit it? Things like that. If you're interested in taking a little bit a step forward with like quality of sound, microphones is another thing, the next thing to consider. You can buy a USB mic, a high quality USB mic, starting at roughly $70 and into the $100 or $150 range. And you can also buy studio style mics that are going to cost you $350 to $400. So it can kind of depend on budget, and it can also depend on what level of sound quality that you're looking to achieve. There are certain things to consider when recording, whether you're using a microphone or not, which would be the room you're in. You want to find quiet room as much as possible, find a way to maybe dampen the walls if you can. But truthfully, some things can be taken care of in the editing software. So if you learn a little bit about editing, you can do it on your own. It is a process that can be tackled by someone if they're ready and willing to learn those types of things. So Odyssey is a free editing software that exists out there. It's free open source audio software. That's AUDACITY. I personally don't use Odyssey because I do have access to the Adobe suite. So I have learned to utilize Adobe Audition. It is a little bit higher end, more technical side of editing, but you can do a lot of little extras like taking out background noise, softening hums in the background, cleaning up the audio to make it sound the next level professional. Because that is one thing, if you choose to do like a conversation or an interview style, and this has happened a few times with directions not included, maybe one of the guests didn't have the best quality microphone, or maybe they were in an environment, or maybe their internet connection was a little bit sketchy. There's little things that when you know how to edit, you can clean that up and make it much easier and much cleaner for the listener. And then the last one in that line there is a hosting platform. So you maybe have heard of like Podbean or SoundCloud. I currently utilize SoundCloud for the podcast that I produce. What these hosting platforms do for you is they give you space, obviously, to post your audio file once you have your final product ready. And then they also provide you with an RSS feed. That is the feed that gets sent out to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, Stitcher, all of the third parties that pull from all of those. That's why you need a hosting platform. Hosting platforms range from a monthly fee, but typically you get a better rate when you pay yearly. And most of the time you're going to need to pay yearly if you're producing more than just one podcast or 3 podcasts maybe in a year. If you're producing one a month, then you're going to need to pay for a yearly, because they base it all on the length of time you use up, or the amount of space, like how many megabytes your file is. So essentially a yearly cost ranges anywhere from like $110 to $160 a year to host your podcast on that platform. And, I've got that's it there. I mean, I know I covered a lot, but what I'm trying to say in that space is you don't need, if you want to get started and you just want to see how it goes, and if you enjoy the idea of podcasting, or if you enjoy, or you think that this could be a platform that would be a good learning experience for people you're trying to reach, you don't need to go crazy with everything to get started. You could literally pick up your cell phone and start recording something and just see where it goes from there. there's a rule of thumb out there that, you want to do maybe 2 to 3 podcasts and kind of not necessarily trash them, but they say when you're getting started, the first couple obviously are going to take you a little bit to get under your belt. As Angela and I worked together, she just got progressively better. Now, Kathryn just recorded her first one as a host. With Kathryn's experience as a leader and speaking in front of groups, she stepped into it really quickly. So her ability to connect with people and talk to them and keep a conversation going forward came about pretty quick. So it all depends on who you are as a person, what your experiences are, and how that can kind of go. Let's set up the next slide there. So there's just my reminder about practice. Just keep in mind that it may not be perfect the first couple recordings, and you may want some help. Obviously, I sit in a position where I've done a lot of different podcasts and worked with different hosts and helped produce. So that's a little bit of that. And if you want to go to the next slide. And I covered this a little bit also. During COVID-19, we recorded our first 10 episodes or 11, because 000 is often like a setup episode explaining what your podcast is going to be all about. But we did that via Zoom on all of ours, which works out pretty well. Zoom is a great platform to utilize if you're considering, starting like a host or an interview or a roundtable style platform. We did do in-studio recording for 11 and 12, which was very nice, actually, to be truthfully be back in front of people. The opportunity to read facial expressions easier. From a technical standpoint, I don't have to worry about internet connections. I don't have to worry about quality of microphone that the other person has on the other side. So that was a benefit. Not a total necessity, but it's a benefit. And then moving forward for directions not included, we're going to utilize both as need be. If guests are local, we're going to try to bring them in and do in studio. And if not, we'll do remote. And there's also the opportunity to combine those two elements as well. And I think one last little thing about from a technical or like a microphone standpoint, what I've noticed is the earbuds that have the microphone on the line actually produce pretty solid quality audio. So when we've had guests on who are using, I don't know if they're necessarily Apple or something else, but the mic that's on the cord, those seem to produce pretty solid audio. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, I've got a set of those, I would say start with one of those, try it out, see if you like the audio quality, and before you maybe necessarily purchase something else. And a quick tip on that is simply make sure that cord is not rubbing on anything while recording. I think that kind of covers that space.
The nuts and bolts of it. Well, thanks for that. And I just want to throw in there, as we move forward, actually last week we recorded my first podcast as host, and we had every intention of being in person at the studio, and 24 hours before we were supposed to record, one of our guests had a cold, and she said it was not COVID, but nonetheless we decided to be on the safe side, and we very rapidly shifted to Zoom. Haven't yet heard the audio from that, but I thought it sounded fine from from a host standpoint. So it is going to be nice to have that option as needed. It also allows us to pull in voices from all over the place. We've had guests from usually locally, but sometimes we have had guests from other parts of the country and other parts of the state. So that adds another nice component to be able to kind of be fluid in that sense. We want to talk a little bit about the way that we use the podcast as a tool. As I said before, these really replaced town hall meetings for our agency. And And Adam, I think, alluded to the fact that our podcast is a little more somewhere between an interview and conversational. There are distinct questions that we provide to our guests, but we also try to make it comfortable and just conversational as possible. So we use it as a tool with two main purposes. As I mentioned before, and our agency, Legacy Center, has a strong focus on the 40 developmental asset model, which is, again, that protective factor model that we like. So we spend a lot of our episodes talking about building developmental assets in youth. You'll see those episodes are the ones that have the green arrows, and they say raising our city. And that raising our city concept is all about, our agency, Legacy Center for Community Success. We're raising up, we're leaving a legacy of strong youth. We're raising these kids up in our community. And so those episodes are going to be very oriented around youth and prevention protective factors. The ones that are in purple, those ones are substance related. So specifically, usually we talk about a specific substance, or we talk about recovery. We talk about how to talk to our kids about substances, for example. So we hit a variety of topics. In every one of our episodes, we try to give some kind of a takeaway, something that people can use in their own lives. But in particular, in those green ones, we always try to have a tip. In our Raising Our City episodes, we always want parents and listeners to be able to walk away and say, here's one simple thing I can do to build up a youth in my community. We also use this as a tool for collaboration. Our organization very strongly believes that there are a lot of experts in our community, and we should elevate their voices and make sure that they are accessible to parents and community members. And so this is a great opportunity for us to collaborate. We've had guests from all over our community on the podcast. It's been a fun way to bring together lots of different people and show that we're good partners. We like partnering with other people. It also expands our reach a little bit. All right, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about a few of our podcasts. Specifically, these ones are our some of our substance ones. And I realized, since this is the show Audition, we really should have had a slide on our "Why Aren't We Whining About It" topic, which was about alcohol, and really heavily focused on the norms of alcohol and how those messages get conveyed to our youth. But Angela didn't put in a slide for that, and I admit she's the one that created this, because it was only a few weeks ago that she left our agency and handed off this opportunity to me. So, all right, so episode 4 was about our Get Your Head Out of the Clouds campaign. A little history on that. The Get Your Head Out of the Clouds campaign is an anti-vaping campaign that was created by students at Midland High School in the leadership class. They were particularly concerned about the long-term impacts and the fact that their peers weren't thinking about that. So, the great thing about that is that this was created through Youth Voice. It was created as peer-to-peer messaging. And we wanted to take the opportunity to give them a voice in our podcast as well. That gave a few, that hit a few key issues there. So we wanted to elevate their voice. We know that people like to hear from youth. We know that we, as society, value the way that they see issues. We also wanted to educate parents and community members about vaping, and we saw this as a perfect opportunity to take these things that kids have learned about vaping and use that to educate parents. And we wanted to connect with schools in order to reach more parents and increase the audience that comes back and listens each issue, or each episode rather. And I will say on that note, we do see a gradual increase in the number of listeners. I think every time that we introduce a new podcast episode, I think that we gain a few more listeners. And some of that is through those collaborations and bringing other voices to the table, having other people share our podcast with the community as well. So.
And at the end of it, she was crying.
I'm going to play a little clip here in just a moment. This is a clip from our A Better Prescription episode, which was about opioids. And our guests were Dr. Kathy Dollard from Mid-Michigan Health. She does all of the behavioral health at Mid-Michigan. Sam Price from 1016 Recovery Network, he's the executive director there. And then Deputy Lance Byerly, who is from the Sheriff's Department and works with us on Narcan trainings in our community. And Deputy Byerly had a really great story that we used as one of our promotional pieces for this particular episode. So I'll go ahead and play that now.
And at the end of it, she was crying, which isn't uncommon for people who have came out of overdosing. And I was just curious, I'm like, well, why are you crying? Well, you're going to take me to jail. Well, no, I'm not. And maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but I recommended, come down, go to Hope Night Handcuffs. And she went with the MS to the hospital. It's not about, getting you in trouble for having this, or it's in your system, so you're going to get charged with, a crime of having the drug, or you had the drug. It is a crisis, and it does need to be addressed, and we need to get them help, not charges.
So one of the things we found with the podcast is that when we can share personal stories, it's really impactful. Those are the things that people enjoy hearing. Those are some of the things that they relate to. So in the Better Prescription podcast, we took it as an opportunity, one, to highlight our coalition and coalition members and share some of the work that we've done as a coalition. It gave us an opportunity to help people understand the purpose of our group as well, and to see really the impact that we have by working together. We talked about Narcan trainings and how bringing together coalition members to lead Narcan trainings leads to a better understanding, make sure that Narcan is out in the community. And this was just a way to highlight those collaborations. Also, the basic education. We're still working on educating the public about the opioid crisis and the treatments that are available. And then the last part of this one was to talk about the Chances Are anti-stigma campaign and help people understand what that's about and how important it is for us to reduce stigma so that treatment is more comfortable for people who are ready for a change in their lives. And then this last episode was a really neat episode. It was a collaboration with another podcast here in our community called The Visibility Project, and Adam works with that group as well. The Visibility Project is a podcast whose sole purpose is to educate or to share the stories, rather, of a variety of people in our community, different walks of life. It's about elevating voices of diversity. And one of the topics that they wanted to talk about were people in recovery. And so together we created 2 podcasts. This is a 2-podcast series. The first episode was on the Visibility Project. The second one was on ours. And so our hope with that was, one, to gain that connection, to show the connection between the 2 podcasts and how we could build off of each other, but also to gain listeners by partnering together. So the first episode shared the stories of each of the individuals that was at the table that day. So Julie Stroyer from Peer 360 shared her story of addiction and recovery. Jeremiah Lee, also, and he's the one that runs the Visibility Project and works at Northwood. He also shared a story of addiction and recovery, but their stories were very different, yet connected. And then Lori Zilkowski from Families Against Narcotics shared her story as a parent of someone who was addicted and brought in the voice of the relationship that families have with someone who has addiction and that journey that they go through together. So it was a neat conversation, that first episode. The second episode then talked about stigma and how hard it is to reach out for help when you feel stigma around you, when you have stigma against yourself. That was an interesting piece that came out, was the conversation about self-stigma. And we talked about the Chances Are campaign again. And then again, it was another opportunity for us to highlight community partnerships and to highlight some of the services that are available in our community. So this was a really great podcast. Really encourage you to go listen to any of them. But this one in particular is fun. And if you pop over to the Visibility Project and listen to it first over there, and then listen on ours. It's a neat connection. All right, Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about analytics.
Sure. You can hit up the next slide there if you'd like. So analytics, depending on what kind of podcast platform you choose, you'll get kind of a different set of analytics or a little bit different details. But SoundCloud, for example, gives us every platform at least is going to give you the number of listens per episode. Number of subscribers can be not as accurate as what the true number is. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, since I utilize SoundCloud, when we see a subscriber via SoundCloud, that is accounted for. But let's say you're using an Apple device, I don't necessarily, those statistics don't cross platforms. So subscribers is a little bit different, but the number of listens, that does transfer across all platforms back to whatever hosting site you're using. So that's just there's some little things to know there, little things I've picked up on and working with different platforms over the last few years. And then location of listeners is something that SoundCloud provides as part of their purchase package. And so it's kind of neat to see just, are you getting your local region? Are you getting outside of it? How does that work? Like if, for example, when we had a couple guests from the Seattle, Washington area, we saw a little bit of a spike and a few listens from that area because of them. And this, if you want to hit the next slide, because they shared that, podcast to their people. So that bullet right there, have guests share the episode. So that's one of the best ways to get the information out there is when you have people involved in your community and involved in different organizations. Ask their organization to share the episode in whatever format they're comfortable in. It might be a simple social media post. Maybe they can include it in a newsletter. Maybe they can even mention it at a presentation, like something like this. So there's a lot of different ways that you can try to leverage that relationship into helping spread the word about your podcast. The other bullet, create branding and a posting schedule to promote the podcast. So, and then even the one underneath it there, create audio clips from each episode to give sneak peeks. All of these elements are important in the idea of just trying to get it out there and in different ways to do so. Create branding is important because then people know what they're looking for when, a certain design, when they go search for your podcast, or if they see your logo, your podcast logo, right on in a newsletter, or if they see it on their phone, it's that recognition. It does not necessarily have to be completely different from your organizational logo. A lot of different companies will just, maybe call it, Greater Midland Community Center Podcast or whatever. And they just use the same logo and maybe add podcast to it. The posting schedule, that could be taken two ways. One, first of all, potentially having a consistent schedule of when your podcast is going to come out. So for the Directions Not Included podcast, we traditionally put it out the first Monday of the month. With Labor Day on September 6th there, so that Monday we're gonna wait a day and put it out on Tuesday, simply because typically vacation time is lower listening rates, and it also has lower participation on social media. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that kind of work, whether you do a little bit of marketing for your organization or just work with a marketing team. So we're going to wait a day and put it out the next day. But generally speaking, it is good to have like a set schedule, not only for yourself to say, okay, we know when we want to get this out, but also for your listeners. If they are a consistent follower of your podcast, then they kind of know, okay, it seems like at the beginning of the month, even if they don't know the exact date, they just kind of always know at the beginning of the month there's going to be a podcast. And I think that covers most anything in the tips and tricks. That there are a lot of different ways to produce a podcast, a lot of different ways to edit podcasts. Obviously, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, and it's on the next slide if you want to hit that, is make it your own and have fun. Just what fits for you, what fits for your organization. How do you produce something that's going to be interesting and have a good time with it? And how do you produce something that you know you can utilize across platforms? I know the Legacy Center has done a great job of getting it out to those that they typically reach out to. Another podcast, Our Community Listens podcast, or the Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities, they have actually started to create curriculum around podcast listening sessions. So what they can do then is basically hand off an episode or a set of episodes, maybe 2 or 3, say, go ahead and have your group, your organization, your people listen to these 3 episodes, and then here are some talking points. So they're kind of creating a package on getting people to utilize them in specific realms. So, they covered parenting as well, and that gives them the opportunity to build something specifically for parents and utilize it in just another fashion instead of just putting it out and the regular people giving it a listen. So it kind of creates opportunity to push it even further. I think that's about it. Anything else that you want to cover, Kathryn, before we hit our last slide? You're muted.
Yeah, I saw that. Thanks. As I was listening to your tips and tricks, one of the tips for success that I learned about in this last episode is how much preparation Angela puts into the podcast, or put into the podcast. And I had my first go around with that. We prepare pretty carefully. So our team comes together early in the year, and we start to outline what podcast topics we're going to cover for the year. We do 12 a year at this point. At that point in time, we also start pinpointing what guests we want to have come on the program. We're careful about who we pick. We've had a few episodes where, sometimes people translate well onto a podcast, and sometimes they're a little bit quiet. You'll hear one of our guests in particular is a wonderful with Narcan trainings. He's got a very gentle demeanor, and he's exactly what we need for that. When we had him on the episode, it was a little more challenging to hear him, and it was just different. It's a different dynamic. So that's something you have to think about. I think that on a podcast, you have to be a little more dynamic than you would be necessarily in front of an audience, in person in front of an audience, because you lose some of those extra cues, the expressions and that kind of thing. But also then about a month before the podcast, we sit down as a team and we start to figure out what that conversation is going to look like. What questions do we want to dig into? What do we want to learn from the guests? And then, Angela and now I created an overview of what our goal is for the podcast. We write up the intro to the podcast, and then we prepare the questions that we're going to ask and get those out into the hands of the guests beforehand. By doing so, we give our guests an opportunity to think through what they want to say, so no one's caught off guard and they can be as prepared as possible. And I think that really helps the conversation to move more smoothly. So if you are going to try this, do the background work first. Make sure that you have that conversation prepped and ready to go. In our case, we don't rehearse anything because it is a casual conversation, but we do make sure that everyone is prepared for what we're going to talk about. We might go off script a little bit. We might ask a question ahead of time. We might throw in an extra follow-up or something like that, but at least we're generally prepared for the direction of the conversation. Any other questions that anyone has today?
I would just like to